At the beginning of the 1940s, America was attacked at the Battle of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese forces. What would follow would be America's entrance into World War II. However, as America ramped up the conscription effort to send men off to battle, a few things stood in the way. In an attempt to crack down on the amount of PTSD suffered in World War I, and not wishing similar mental illnesses to affect men after World War II, the Army Psychiatric Division decided to start listing a series of mental illnesses that would bar men from service. Primarily among them was pyromania, manic hysteria, depression, kleptomania, vagrancy, and fundamentally, homosexuality. Granted, while sodomy was against the law to begin with, homosexuality was seen as more of less an act and more as a mental illness. It was very loosely understood at this time, and much of the understandings around homosexuality were draped in pseudoscientific dogma and religious fundamentalism. A similar sentiment will be mirrored in Nazi Germany, as many homosexuals, including some POWs, were sent to camps designated to cure the concept of homosexuality, deeming it as less of a illness among people and a medical system to later cure on. This would set the stage for a dark moment in gay history, the concept of the post-Freudian conversion therapy, a system in which homosexuality would no longer continue to be seen as merely a divergent act, but as an affliction to be cured, with the numerous members of pseudoscientific medical experiments, religious fundamentalism, and other dark horrors that I make shudder to think about to this day. The affliction will be reversed no longer by God, but reversed by man and his new machines in a new age. This sparred one of the darkest moments for medical history in the modern day, and one of the darkest moments for homosexual people coming out of the 1940s and 1950s, and would set the stage for much of the beliefs, sentiments, and actions surrounding homosexuality and the gay community for decades to come. Now, many men were barred from service along homosexual lines initially at the draft point, but there were even more men and women who served in World War II that were later found guilty of homosexuality and discharged from service dishonorably. This stain stays with many of those people to this day, as it has not been fixed by any member of the political government, nor has been advocated for in the 70 years since World War II. In the post-World War II era of the 1950s, along with the advent of civil rights movements in the post-war era, gay men and women joined up with men of color in order to fight for their civil rights, along with many other minorities at this time. What was unique among the homosexual population is that the government couldn't handle the civil rights acts of gays as they could along racial lines with people of color. In 1952, President Eisenhower signed an executive order outlining that gay people were barred from service in political jobs and allowed companies in the private sector to discriminate against them, under the auspices of McCarthyism-era paranoia, claiming the Lavender Scare. This is to say that gay people could be blackmailed by Soviet agents into giving up government secrets to hide their homosexuality. A problem that could easily be solved by simply legalizing homosexuality and fostering a supportive environment for them would unfortunately be passed by the side. In lieu of this, the American Psychiatric Association would attempt to cure the problem of gay people in a way that the government couldn't do with the civil rights considerations. This mainly came to a point of committing gay people to a series of medical institutions, treatment centers, and conversion sites, all alleged to cure, quote-unquote, the homosexual belief and the homosexual actions of people. At the time, there was little actually understood about homosexuality, as much of the beliefs of homosexuality at this time had not changed much since its original condemnation in 1869, this stating that homosexuality was merely a series of divergent behaviors from the social norm. The grasp and breadth of what homosexuality was so vague at the time that numerous other mental illnesses could easily be fit in with it. Thus, there became a large overlap between mental illness, misunderstandings of that mental illness, and where homosexuality fit into that in a sort of swirling soup and mishmash of different understandings. This is also to say that there was no, at the time, proper scientific diagnosis for what homosexuality was. Different schools of thought in psychiatry, which mainly funded this operation, would give you different descriptions of homosexuality. As it is very basically a general statement, I should say, in our modern day, but the course of this problem represents for physicians is that without a proper scientific diagnosis of a problem, treatment is almost impossible. If we don't know what's causing the problem, how can we search for a solution? However, this would not, however, be a problem for psychiatrists at the time, as they would commit to a series of ad hoc and fly-by-night treatment systems popularized at the time in order to treat homosexuality, many of which being reminiscent of the treatment of POWs in the medical horrors of the World War II Holocaust underseen under Joseph Mengele. It is also important that we note that gay people and gay publications were not well known or commonly found at this time. It was also completely unacceptable for gay works to be published. During the Weimar Republic, there was several scholars who wrote on homosexuality and the concepts of normalizing it. However, much of these writings were destroyed by the Nazi Party, and very few of them ever even reached America to begin with before being censored by religious groups, as well as puritanical beliefs within academia. That is to say that with no one to explain the homosexual experience, and no one to explain how homosexuals could function in a society, and no real expertise on the subject besides people with biased agendas and political leanings, there was not really much hope for gay people to expect a clean medical diagnosis. And since the psychiatric divisions were more inclined to trying to solve a problem where they didn't know it existed, there was very much a mix of methods on how to do this, most of them bordering on the lines of religious torture. However, before we go into the depths of it, I would like to state one thing before I go further. The topics we are about to discuss are quite harrowing, and I would suggest viewer discretion to be advised. These topics will be brought to you with a series of citations below the video, and while there may be fewer quotes within the actual videos themselves, as we are discussing general topics, to research and do your own readings on these topics, it is well-known knowledge. Nothing I'm going to say here is nothing that cannot be found in the books and texts. To begin, it's important that we recognize that since the 1860s, much of the beliefs of homosexuality came from religious scripture and doctrine. As a result, many of the same methods used to treat the illness would initially come from religious veins. This would be seen in a way of, for America at least, the most common practice to treat homosexuality was a form of religious indoctrination, typically taking place at what was known as conversion sites or conversion camps at the time. These would consist of hellfire condemnations, in which a loud and boisterous preacher would aggressively preach about the sins and degeneracy of homosexuality to a large group of homosexual men. And it is notable to say that most of the afflicted parties in this group were men, as there were fewer women to be dealing with this homosexuality discrimination as much. This is not to say that men and women didn't face discrimination of equal measure and equal horror, but that typically the numbers did skew more towards men. Another form of this would also be the bully pulpit, from which gay people were sentenced to long, drowning hours of sitting in a church, being constantly remarked for their sins and problems, having all the problems in their lives typically attached to their homosexuality. A sort of long-arm gaslighting for hours on end inside a hot, stuffy room designed to make you uncomfortable and make you hot, itchy, and more susceptible to the concepts being taught. A third version would be vigorous Bible study. Many of these men would be locked in rooms or tents or personal quarters for days, if not hours on end, constantly reading the Bible and reciting scripture, taking notifications, scribbling, scripturing, and various other types of Bible study used in clergy and seminary schools in order to help them better understand the religious sentiment. Understand that much of this is not actually proven to have worked, but it was a prevailing thought at the time that you could simply, quote, pray the gay away. Gay women would be forced to undergo this religious fundamentalism, regardless of their faith, by the way, and given over to typically Catholic or Baptist devotions, regardless of original basis. This is to say that a man who was a Jewish gay would be given over to a Catholic conversions camp and be forced to convert to Catholicism, and engage in Catholicism teaching and philosophies with no actual advocacy for himself, regardless of his consent. This system obviously backfired immensely, as many of the conversion sites would be full of gay men, left alone for months, if not years at a time, with no real outside interference. Such horrors would include a system of entrenched homophobia, internalized homophobia, retreating farther into the closet even if they weren't gay, coming to believe that their problems were not caused by a series of genetic issues or misunderstandings among peers, but that they were in fact possessed by gay demons, as well as a several series of intimate depressions. If you're trapped in a camp for a long period of time, constantly being told you're a horrible person, with no real way to get out, it's very clear that suicide and depression is going to be a very common factor. On a lighter note, this also led to a lot of gay rendezvous occurring and people who would simply play along for the time, claiming to be converted by Christianity or what have you, only to get out and continue engaging in homosexual acts just in a more secretive fashion, or they would simply make friends or lovers at the camp who would later keep in contact as religious pen pals or Bible study buddies later down the road to disguise their secret romanticisms. While this is also very concurrent in modern-day conversion sites, it is important to understand that when we are talking about this is a time period where much about homosexuality and medical science was not understood, and there was very much a limit to the understandings of DNA, genetic mutations, and genetic operations among human bodies, as well as just general medical practice in general. Now, we can see traces of this moving into the modern day. Churches still run conversion therapy systems, except now they move them more towards children, and they are under some greater regulation due to the fact they have children, but much of the actual beliefs remain the same. Much of the anti-gay conversion system is simply just biblical resuscitation, which doesn't really address the problem, and so therefore it's not really a solution. But, however, the same stressors do come out. We do see children who survive the conversion camps coming out typically with entrenched homophobia, internalized homophobia, series of depression or suicidal thoughts, and often coming out, in most cases, worse off than when they went in. Instead of fostering a safe and healthy environment, this was much of a problem. Now, I know what you're going to say. Well, there's a good chance that, like you said, they didn't understand how these things worked, so they would naturally do that. Except much of the understanding about how to do these types of camps was studied from the Holocaust directly. There was direct links and medical research into how people who survived the Holocaust would be racked with the scars of what they saw and experienced, and yet those same principles were not being applied to the conversion camps in America. This is to say that there was a systematic reason why the two were not being compared, and mostly it was to allow psychiatry to operate unhindered and for religious groups to continue to victimize a group that they had had problems with since the 1930s. It is also important to recognize that both the conversion camps of today and the conversion camps during this time in gay history were in fact both operating under the same principles. There was very little government oversight. There was very little need to report medical findings to an actual medical board, and in both cases, these individuals themselves were kept against their will, regardless of their status or ability to decide for themselves. In short, the federal government took away the rights of citizens, put them into conversion camps under auspices of solving a problem that it could not regulate out, and handed them over to sadistic religious fundamentalists who would fundamentally break them down and commit to psychological torture in order to handle a problem that really wasn't a problem in a way that doesn't make any sense to even the basis level of thought. This same system still applies in the same mannerism today, but we will talk about that later on in the video. Now, while much of this type of religious conversion system for gay people was operating without the realms of the government to really watch and find over the middling parts, it was eventually kind of known that this type of religious indoctrination wasn't working. By the 1960s, it was becoming clear that religious indoctrination was not curbing the homosexual behavior, and that homosexuals were becoming more emboldened due to the uptick in civil rights cases, the Vietnam War, a lot would later be coming on, the social movements would start to shift away from this type of devoted religious thinking, as well as the hippie movement, which inspired more towards free love, a lack of hatred and discrimination against people, protesting that love is what it is and that it doesn't matter who you love, as well as a large push to drugs territory and expanding one's mind through chemical additives. This is to say that society was starting to open up to the plights of minorities and oppressed people in a way that it wouldn't be very optically granted for the government to be seen whisking gay people off to large conversion sites for the religious fundamentalists to handle. As a result, and taking inspiration from the nightmares of the Nazi death camps, several medical procedures were granted as the gay community was moved less into conversion sites and more into medical facilities or asylums, as we would now learn to call them today. These types of medical procedures were often considered cutting edge at the time, but still had no backing in actual medical science. Rather, there was newly developed information as technology moved forward, but this information was being used fast and loose to apply to a lot of psychological theories with no real weight behind them. Such of these medical experimentations include lobotomies, which is to say that someone would take a long steel pick or a long steel rod, and by inserting it through various orifices in the skull, sever or in some way distract the lobes of the brain from properly communicating with each other. This was typically used to anesthetize or to pacify a lot of violent people, violent criminals, or people with mental illnesses that made them hyperactive, because essentially, in the case of a full frontal lobotomy, you would be severing the communicational bridge between the two left and right spheres of the brain, which effectively zombifies people. Now, this type of treatment was not really known exactly how it worked, and you are essentially handing a person who is not a licensed neurosurgeon tools to mess around in someone's brain with nothing more than literally fly-by-night and a diagram. There was no x-rays at this time. Nobody was x-raying your brain and watching where the pick went in as we do now with MRI. This was mostly them putting it into your eye socket, getting a general direction, and banging it through with a hammer. Much of which was done, again, without consent and forcibly pushed onto gay people. Later, after lobotomies stopped being effective, electroshock therapy was later invented. Electroshock therapy essentially consists of hooking a person up to a numerous of diodes and probes and repeatedly electrocuting them in an attempt to rewire their brain to be more conditioned to the normal activities. Now, the principle of this theory based on the idea that, once again, homosexuality was a deviant act, and so by constantly electrocuting people while either asking them questions, showing them subliminal propaganda, or simply just continually electrocuting them would solve the problem of them being gay and would rewire the brain to work normally. This actually caused a lot of people to die, as it's essentially a lightweight electric chair, and the system for utilizing it was pretty much fly-by-night, and it had no level of standardization whatsoever. So you could be electroshocked with a system that was just generating volts, or a system that also generated amps. In which case the person would in fact die. And very often in these conversion therapies, people did die. There was also the matter of restraining people, or what is known as restraint therapy. This is to say people who were gay were locked into straitjackets and left in padded rooms for hours, if not days at a time, with the lights on, unable to disseminate exactly when or where they were, and then being moved around from room to room until they were basically completely desensitized before being fed nothing but propaganda for hours on end, and repeating the process ad nauseum. This system is now considered a torture tactic, by the way, in the legal sense. Another facet that was more common in Britain, but would see numerous applications in America, although with a bit more oversight from the medical board, and by a bit I mean very much a little bit, was the concept of chemical castration. Chemical castration was done in a way to prevent the sexual urges of a homosexual man, in the case that if we took out the driving force behind the sexual act, the homosexual would not be homosexual anymore. Essentially approaching the idea of homosexuality from a sexual, physical perspective instead of a simply sociological or interpersonal relation. This is, however, to effectively make the male reproductive system completely damaged and to cause intense chemical issues for years on end. This system did not simply consider the normal way of castration, which is to apply chemicals to a man's testicles to remove them, but rather a consistent diet of chemical additives designed to target the male reproductive system and render him sterile. This also, by the way, would decrease the actual function of the testes and would have other ramifications on the human body that could lead to depression, organ failure, neurological issues, hallucinations, and a variety of other problems, depending on what chemical was used. And a variety of chemicals were used in that fashion, some of which were not even intentionally designed to do that, but just happened to have an after effect. Now, while women did manage to escape chemical castration in a few ways, for the women, it was either essentially a form of vaginal mutilation, where carbonic acid would be dipped onto the clitoris, or a series of showing females films with erotic male imagery in them, or basically like mom and dad Leave It to Beaver propaganda films to try and make them more enticed with the heterosexual and heteronormative agenda. Considering chemical castration, vaginal mutilation, or watching some male pornos and a couple reruns of Leave It to Beaver, I think I could tell you which one I would prefer in that situation. All of these medical procedures, and I use the term medical very loosely, would also occur alongside beatings, drugging food, and subliminal messaging after hours, if not days, of sleep deprivation. All of this forced upon gay people without any consent from them, without much knowledge from a medical board, and mostly just out of sight from what the general populace was establishing. These people also did not have much of an advocate. And while some asylums did engage with therapeutic means and did keep notes on the matter, much of the notes were merely just reports on what had happened, but nothing dealing from the actual people themselves. So even during these treatment sessions, there wasn't a lot of information from the patients about how they were feeling, mostly just that if they were working or not. And you can understand where this would be a big problem. If we constantly torture someone, and then ask them if it's working, they're going to tell us whatever we want to hear to make the pain stop. Unfortunately, to a crowd of people that were going to torture you in the first place, this makes the fundamental idea look like it's successful, which caused a negative feedback loop in how this system ran for so long. Gay people would be tortured, someone would ask if it's working, they of course would play along to stop the torture and pain and to leave this nightmare, which of course would make it look like they're a success, and the system gets to continue on forward, as that is the original design of the US government, was to try and curtail the homosexual issue. So, if you're ever wondering why these types of treatments went on for so long, it's because there was a self-fulfilling prophecy inherently built into them. And these processes did went on for a long time. Many of those practices would in fact continue until the early 1980s, in America at least. With psychiatrists all operating under outdated beliefs in homosexuality as being atypical or some type of social divergence. This typically being backed by religious groups who would often provide them with subjects or use the horrors as a way of entrenching fear within the populace. It is important to note that during my research, I discovered many references to psychiatrists being used to silence children who would speak out against the abuse within the church. It's not unheard of or unknown for sexual assault to occur in these medical facilities. Sexual assault, sexual misconduct, rape, and other such problems in these cases occur to this day in these types of facilities, not just in America, but around the world. There's always some doctor who's doing something wrong with some of his patient staff. It's a pretty common thing. Now, when we expand this to the idea that these were gay people who were seen as less than people, that were seen as divergent from society, the issue expands even greater. We also have this idea that the conversion therapy was expanding into children. There was a big fear between the 1960s, 70s, and 80s at this time that gay people were targeting children in a way to produce more gay people, as if that's how it worked. In which case, when that would happen, we would see in the late 1960s and early 1970s a sharp rise of gay children, into these groups, into these asylums. However, there wasn't a lot of research I could bring forward on that, so unfortunately that's where I have to leave that topic because much of it diverged away from my initial readings on the treatment of gay people in America in terms of conversion therapies. Now, moving forward from those two dark points, it is important that we state the following. By the late 1970s, sexologists, medical experts, and psychologists did begin to reevaluate the claims made by the common conversion therapy groups that these functions worked and that they were proper ways to treat gay people. This is also spurred on by the cultural movements that were happening at that time around with the Vietnam era, with the movement away from religion and into new ways of thinking and the abandonment of traditional American values. There's also something to be said that many gay people did survive these conversion therapies, and they would later go on to write about their experiences in small and minor ways that would eventually leak into academia and warrant people looking into these things. It started a conversation, and that's the important part. There would be numerous studies gone into, such as studies about homoerotic stimuli, interviews with survivors of these conversion therapies, who would later become activists in the gay movement, along with a secularization of mental health away from religious dogma. This is to say that because of these social movements occurring, there was a greater emphasis placed on the interluding of gay people at this time. Unfortunately, this would also mean that for about 30 years, gay people were being systematically and medically tortured for a long time to try and prevent them from occurring, and only through several acts of gracious people were they able to find advocates for themselves. Because a few people decided to take a second look at what was being said, there was a chance that the word could get out and that change could be made. Now, this type of analysis of gay theory and the conversion systems these people went through would later continue to expand and be researched over the next few decades. With the onset of AIDS in the 1980s and 1970s, there was an even greater look by the medical community into the types of suffering of gay people. Lots of gay people who actually survived conversion camps would go on to become activists who would tell their stories and help give voice to some of the people who were suffering from AIDS. And through the digital age and the understanding of DNA and medical sciences expanding with technology as time went on, it was very soon, or very recently, that homosexuality stopped becoming a sort of degenerate, disassociative break from tradition, and more seen as a alternative to be perfectly healthy and perfectly natural within a human species. As well as many of the practices used to treat homosexuality becoming outlawed and disdained by the medical community. This was a turning point in the fight for gay rights, not only for the fact that there was getting more and more medical science and academic research to back up a concept, but also the idea that the ways in which we had been approaching homosexuality were wrong and that it was a time for a change. Homosexuality would begin to become more of a background as people began to share their stories, there was greater understanding reaching into the populace, and there was more and more advocacy among people. Churches would later have to stop the constant attacks on gay people, or at least stop the ability of moving them into conversion camps whenever they spoke up, as gay people had managed to find their voice in a world that was growing to understand them. The field of psychology also moved to denounce some of the claims that had been made during the former period as well, from the 1950s to the 1960s, on how gay people were to be treated and the ways that caused homosexuality, and moved towards a specific diagnosis of homosexuality. Now, at this time, there wouldn't be a removal of homosexuality from the mental illnesses category, and many beliefs in academia based in puritanical culture, as well as religious fundamentalism, caused people to still consider homosexuality to be a disease, and this new way of thinking to just be people pandering to degeneracy. But it didn't really matter that there was research into the issue. What mattered is that people were not willing to forgive their beliefs they had grown up with for so long about gay people, and there was powers that were invested in keeping them from doing so. There would also be movements by the medical community to decry some of the pseudoscientific treatment options that were deployed against gay people. That is, in fact, one of the things I learned in my research. Many medical boards do admit that what happened during these conversion therapies was borderline torture. There's also a large amount of people that started investigating into lobotomies, as well as electroshock therapy, all of which discovered that it was complete scientific hokum. And there was a few charges pressed against certain groups for the deaths of the gay people that had died in conversion camps, but it was nothing much on par, and as I said, a lot of that research took me too far away from the suffering of gay people in conversion therapies during this time frame, so I had to leave it out of this video. I would like to end this video on a happy note. I would like to say that conversion therapies were done away with, and that everyone lived happily ever after, that the people who suffered under these oppressive regimes were given proper therapy and treatment to solve some of the trauma they went through. I'd like to tell you that gay people received reparations from the government that had sought to destroy them, and I would like to say that the idea of conversion therapy was completely outlawed across the board, and that gay activists were the ones who did it. I would really like to say that. I would like to say that everybody lived happily ever after. Unfortunately, that would be an injustice. Much of the scars of this period in history still remain to this day and still leave lasting impressions along the gay community moving forward in the world. Many of the people who were scarred and traumatized by these practices never received compensation for themselves or their loved ones. Many people would later go on to feel bigotry and face bigotry based on the same beliefs that had scarred them and put them out of home and out of a livelihood and into these conversion sites, but feeling it from the public audience that they couldn't strike easily back at, or that they could believe that people they lived with thought this was acceptable. Worse still, religious entities faced very little backlash for their part that they played in this tragedy, as well as the emphasis they placed upon conversion therapies. Very few of the conversion therapy groups that ran these operations faced any backlash either. While there was some individual lawsuits, they didn't receive much help from the government, and it was pretty much just pressed under the rug and swept away. You'll find very little speak in history books about this, and unfortunately, much of what the survivors wrote has passed out, as many of them had died during the AIDS crisis, so there was plenty of diary entries I could read from, but not a lot of interviews left for medical community, or ones that were committed to a digital copy. I'm sure there are some interviews out there on Hardstock. And to bring forward another point and as to how this concept impacts our modern day, many religious groups still maintain sites to this day in the U.S. with very little oversight and even less regulation. The same groups that ran conversion sites back in the 1950s and 60s are still doing it to this day, and even along the same principles. Religious groups have also exported the ideas of conversion therapy into the developing world, where they carry out the same barbaric and medieval medical treatments to this day, away from the prying eyes of the American government and away from the places where American activists can get a handle on this. All again with very little resistance. While there are some groups that have moved to challenge this, much of them have lost steam over the past few years. And that is to say between 2008 to about 2016, as far as my research led. Many lives were given over to conversion therapy, and in fact the problem still persists to this day with children. We see the same type of impacts occurring with children in conversion camps, the same style of religious bigotry and gaslighting occurring, and in a lot of cases there's no real way for these kids to get advocacy either, and they face the same troubles and struggles as gay people did back in the 1950s. That is to say that much of what had happened back then still occurs to this day. They just happen to choose a different target that people still don't care much about, and that is to say children. It is also important to note that many of these groups that had carried this out actively promote these ideas. This isn't to say that a company who would do conversion sites or a church that did conversion sites in the 1950s doesn't brag about the fact that they do conversion sites now. That's a big thing to them. Hey, we've been doing conversions for 70 years. Not realizing that also means that you've been torturing people for 70 years and being allowed to operate almost with impunity. As like I said, there's very little government oversight, and what claims by medical boards or government regulators to go in and inspect often gets stopped by those same religious groups claiming a freedom, separation of church and state, and a freedom from the government. And wherever they do get pressed into this, they merely move the conversion site out of country where the government has no jurisdiction to operate, or they move into a country where the government doesn't have direct ties or extradition rights to continue moving forward with it. So very much the sins and problems that faced gay people in the 1950s are still around today, it just happened to move its address. Many lives were given in the march for the progress we have now. The knowledge that the gay community enjoys today about the normality of homosexuality, about how homosexuality is not something to be ashamed of, but something to be proud in, and that homosexuality is not a disease to be treated through barbaric means, but rather as just another speck and spice into the melting pot that is life. Unfortunately, much of this was gained from those who suffered in conversion sites under pseudoscientific science and religious dogma. While their sacrifices may have caused a wider understanding in the medical field, these scars are deep, and they will need time and treatment to heal. We can't just ignore these ideas. We can't just ignore the fact that many gay people, after serving in World War II, were simply taken and hushed right away into the same things that they were fighting against in Europe, but on American soil. We can't talk about the fact that the American government literally endorsed the idea that some of its citizens should be put into camps, tortured until they agreed to become one with society, and then simply act as if they never did anything wrong. And we sure as hell can't sit here and pretend that what these people went through doesn't deserve some type of personal treatment or reparations for their suffering. And I know reparations is a hard concept for many Americans to get behind in any sense, let alone for gay people. But most important of all, we cannot allow the ideas that grew out of this country to be exported elsewhere, away from our shores, where the same social dynamics don't occur, where the same openness about homosexuality isn't analyzed, and where the same scrutiny against religious dogma is not available to some people. We have a duty to end the conversion therapy of gay people, not just on our own shores, but also on the shores of which we've exported it. Because what happens over here matters over there. And now with this, I would issue a call to action. Do some research on your own. Look into the suffering of your family members or people your family members knew who went to these conversion camps. Interest yourself in some of the conversion camps that exist here in America. Get educated about how gay people were initially put into this type of conversion camp by reading some of the diary entries that exist online and watching some of the memoirs from people who had to go through these camps and who they lost and how they managed to do it. You'll be interested to find out how many of them, in a lot of ways, share similar survival stories to that of Holocaust survivors of the same era when this was occurring. I'd like to thank you all for sitting with me with this topic. It was pretty heavy and research was very much in depth. And I appreciate you for understanding that gay people should not be subject to religious dogma or pseudoscientific medical experiments, and that the suffering they endured deserves to be recognized and advocated against, as well as repaired in some way. Thank you much. Try to have a good day.